For this week, we're looking at Chapter 19 in Lewis Vaughan's Doing Ethics, and we're going to be considering the topic of political violence, looking at war, terrorism, and torture. And the central question that we're going to be looking at is when, if ever, are we morally justified in resorting to violence? Now, to ask a question like that, it would be helpful for us to first define some of our terms. So we're considering three different areas here. We're considering is it ever morally justified to resort to violence when it comes to terrorism? And we'll look at some definitions of terrorism. Is it ever justified to resort to violence when it comes to war? Or to torture someone for the purpose of maybe extracting information from them. And so we're going to have to define each of these terms, but we probably should start with violence. So violence, specifically violence against people, is the physical or psychological attack on or the vigorous abuse of persons, causing their suffering, injury, or death. Now, typically, violence is seen as being prima facie wrong, which means that it's wrong unless someone can provide a good reason for thinking that it's actually morally permissible. So violence just in and of itself is usually seen as just being wrong. And the question is, are there ever exceptions? Are there ever good reasons for thinking that it's wrong? And we're going to look at some possible reasons that people will give. But first, what is it that actually makes violence wrong? There's several different principles that we could appeal to. We could say that it's wrong because it violates people's rights, or we could say that it's wrong because it violates principles of justice, freedom, or utility. There could be many different principles that are used to show that violence is indeed wrong. We could say that it just makes society worse than if there were no violence that were present. And we could also appeal to the bad consequences of violence, and the bad consequences usually outweigh the good, and that would be sort of a utilitarian argument there. So the real question is, if it's wrong, if it's prima facie wrong, are there any exceptions? Well, some exceptions that people propose is war. War is a form of political violence because the essence is violent conflict between political communities. Now, most people think about war as being a violent conflict between different countries or nations, but there could also be examples of civil war where it's a war between two political parties. And so the moral questions about war are how, if ever, can war be justified? If war is indeed an exception where violence would be permissible, then what is it that makes this an exception? What makes it justified? And then the other question that we have to ask is if we assume that it is justified, then how do we actually conduct it in a way that is morally permissible? So the first question then is, can war be justified? Well, there are three main positions that we will consider in this chapter. The first position is realism. When it comes to realism, so the realist position will say that yes, violence is something that is not morally permissible, but when it comes to uh, cases of war, our ordinary moral standards are just not applicable anymore. So violence is usually not permissible, but war is one of these exceptions. And when it comes to war, we change the way we think about our moral standards and we judge war based upon how well it serves a state's interests. And that it becomes sort of the new moral standards for how we think about this exception when it comes to violence. Then you have the pacifist position, which says that war is never morally permissible. So there are no exceptions. Violence is wrong, and whether we're talking about war, whether we're talking about torture, whether we're talking about terrorism, there are no exceptions. War is never morally permissible because violence is never permissible. And then you have this third position, which is called the just war theory. And according to the just war theory, war may be morally permissible under certain conditions. Now, what makes the just war theory different than the realist position is the realist position is saying that we don't have the same moral standards when it comes to situations of war. The just war theory will say, no, we still do have the same moral standards, but embedded within those moral standards are certain exceptions. So we have to look at what are those exceptions when it comes to just war theory. What are the requirements to make a war, in fact, just? And there are 6 conditions that we can look at. The first condition is that the war must be just. There must be a just cause for someone going to war. So you should not go to war with someone because they have resources that you want. There must be some just cause. The second condition is that it must be sanctioned by a proper authority. So you can't just have any average citizen within a country declaring war on someone else. There is a proper channel of authority that the declaration of war must go through. The third is that it must be fought with the right intentions. And so the motivations matter when it comes to why a country would go to war against another country. The fourth is that it should be the last resort. So war should never be the first thing that somebody appeals to. After there are other negotiations going on, if there's no way to resolve the conflict, war should always be the last resort. Fifth, the good, when it comes to the war, must be proportional to the bad. In other words, uh, you should not go to war if you think that the outcome of it will be worse than what it is uh, than when you go into the war. So the good must be proportional to the bad or outweigh the bad if possible. And then the sixth one is that there must be a reasonable chance of success. So those are the 6 conditions for whether or not there's a just war. The next idea that we're looking at is terrorism. And terrorism can be defined as violence against non-combatants for political, religious, or ideological ends. So one of the main things that makes this different from situations of war is that in situations of war, you have a military, you have combatants who are warring for political causes. Well, here now you bring in non-combatants. So oftentimes you might have citizens who are acting for political, religious, ideological reasons, and they are uh, doing violent acts against other non-combatants. So you could think of many examples that have come up recently in our culture, where you have the U.S. Capitol riots, you have uh, political protests that have been taking place all around the country, and when the question of whether or not something becomes terrorism is when there's violence against non-combatants for political, religious, or ideological reasons. And so sometimes terrorism is seen as a potential exception to violence. And so the main questions that we have to ask is number one, what should our moral response be to terrorism? Does this actually count as an exception? Can terrorist actions ever be morally justified? Well, we'll consider some reasons, or this chapter considers some reasons and arguments for and against terrorism. The last concept that we'll look at is torture. So torture is a use of violence that inflicts severe pain or suffering on people to punish them, intimidate them, or to extract information. Now, if torture is being used to extract information, 3 issues are necessary to consider of when it comes to the morality of torture. The first one is, does it really work? So there's a lot of research on whether or not torture is an effective form of extracting information. And so some people, when they're evaluating the morality of torture, they're thinking about it more as a consequentialist. Like if this works, then maybe it's morally permissible. If it doesn't work, then why would we use this means of extracting information? But there's also non-consequentialist questions that we could ask. Whether it works or not, is torture ever morally acceptable? So a non-consequentialist would would maybe have a principled reason for saying that it's never morally acceptable. And then the third is, what should the state's policy be regarding the use of torture? Those are three issues concerning the morality of torture. So let's consider how moral theories uh, influence how we think about these three different areas. Consequentialists, for example, could really argue both ways when it comes to the issue of just war and when it comes to the issue of arguing for, say, pacifism. So if we think specifically of utilitarians, there have been utilitarians that have argued that anti-war pacifism must always be true. In other words, they argue that there's never a situation where the greatest good will be done by the result of war. There's never a situation where where war would be used to bring about the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. But of course, there have been utilitarians that have argued the other way. So critics of anti-war pacifism will often say that there's no evidence that pacifism always results in less death and suffering in war. And one of the common examples that come up is World War II, where many critics of pacifism say if there's any war that is an example of the greatest good being the result of going to war, it would be World War II. And so, if you're a consequentialist, you could really argue both ways. Now, when it comes to non consequentialist reasonings, uh, both pacifists and non pacifists can find support from non consequentialist reasoning. For example, a pacifist could rest their case on just the simple right to life. And so we shouldn't go to war with anyone because we're violating a right to life. But of course, the non pacifist can just rely on other non consequentialist principles, such as the right of self defense or the defense of basic human rights in general. And so when it comes to the debates over uh, war pacifism versus non pacifism, whether you're a consequentialist or non consequentialist, there are arguments on both sides that can be made. Well, what about the issue of terrorism? When it comes to the issue of terrorism, absolute non consequentialists or immunity theorists would hold that it is always wrong to intentionally kill non combatants. So there's not a case where terrorism would be morally permissible in this case. Whereas if you're a consequentialist, on the other hand, you could possibly justify terrorism, but only under conditions that the terrorists in the flesh will find it difficult to satisfy. So, are the terrorist acts effective and efficient? That's one consideration. But also, are no non terrorist actions likely to yield better results? So, if you can't think of any other non terrorist means for achieving the results that are necessary, then in those conditions, a consequentialist could possibly justify the use of terrorism. And so, uh, terrorism, if you're a non consequentialist, typically is not considered morally permissible, but there are arguments that can be made from a consequentialist perspective. And then last, torture. Non consequentialists are likely to view torture as always wrong because it violates the rights of persons by severely diminishing their autonomy as individuals. And then consequentialists, they could make an argument both ways. They could accept or reject torture depending on an assessment of the likely effects. A consequentialist may conclude that torture is justified in rare cases in which it could prevent a massive attack or lead to the destruction of a terrorist cell, but she could also include that all things considered, torture is never the best option. So that's how you could apply these moral theories to the issue of war, terrorism, and torture. I'm not going to cover the arguments that can be made for different positions in this lecture. To get the arguments, make sure that you read carefully through the end of the chapter, and then after you read the chapter, take your last quiz and let me know if you have any questions.